So hello and welcome to the latest episode of the new P&L, Principles and Leadership in Business, the podcast series. I'm Paul, host of the new P&L, and I'm very grateful you've taken the time to listen today. If you're listening on iTunes or Spotify or another streaming platform, please take a moment to review us or rank us. It always helps with our rankings and our ratings. And if you'd like to become part of the new P&L community, please go to principlesandleadership.com and subscribe. So we believe business needs a new P&L, one that is as much focused on principles and leadership as it is on profit and loss. Because we know if your principles are right and aligned with your purpose, and your business and leadership has a clear focus and vision and strength and empathy, then your company should be in profit and not loss in so many ways. This week, for the first time on the new P&L, I've got two special guests on one podcast, Roshni Patel and Bewers, the two former Accenture senior executives who over recent years have taken their professional skill set and applied them to helping social impact businesses start up, grow and succeed. So Roshni and Kelly, a very warm welcome to the new P&L Principles and Leadership in Business podcast series. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Pleasure. As it's the first time, as I said earlier, we've had two guests. It'd be great if you could both start by giving us just a bit of a potted summary of your respective experience and what you're doing now in the social impact and enterprise sector. Perhaps if we start with you, Kelly.
Great, thank you, Paul. Yeah, and real pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
So most recently, I was the managing director of a social enterprise called Year Here, which is a social innovation program and startup incubator in the UK, which now has over 30 impact businesses in its portfolio. I'm also the non-exec director on the board of two of those. And previously to that, as you said, I was at Accenture for 8 years. I started in the financial services consulting practice, which is actually where I met Roshni. And then spent the last few years there in Accenture Development Partnerships, which is actually a small global not-for-profit arm of the business working with global NGOs. So I suppose you could say I've had a sort of decade-long applied MBA in understanding all these different models of change and innovation. And what I've learned from that so far is that both from the corporate world of financial services and management consulting to working with Oxfam, Amnesty International, and most recently running a social enterprise, is that we can't have truly purposeful businesses until we have a purposeful economy. And that's a hypothesis that I've seen sort of radically accelerated with the current socioeconomic crises. And it's now something that I'm exploring myself with a number of projects and ideas.
Okay, thank you. And Roshni.
Thanks, Paul. As you mentioned, I had a long-standing career with Accenture. I was in the financial services consulting business based in the UK, but worked with lots of different banks across the world and focused on all things digital transformation, design and innovation, specifically with new technology, helping banking clients solve large, complex strategic problems. Earlier in my career, I also had a couple of projects in the UK and in Asia with some NGOs focusing on social impact through the program that Kelly most recently worked on through ADP, which is brilliant. And so through both my commercial work and that work with the social impact NGOs in Asia and UK, it was clear my passion is all around how do we identify, shape and enable impactful change. And we can define impactful in many ways, but do that in a way which uses experience-led design, new models, new technology, and new ways of doing things. So now, after a fairly long and amazing career break, I'm working on a number of very interesting projects in the sustainability, design, and innovation world. And those are ranging from topics focusing on low-income financial inclusion, Gen Z wealth creation, mental health, and diversity and inclusion more broadly in innovation. So very exciting.
Very exciting, and keeping you both very busy.
Yes.
Yes. I think it would be good to, with that experience in mind for both of you, to sort of set the context for the discussion today in terms of social enterprises. Kelly, you mentioned Year Here. For those who don't quite understand my accent, it's probably yeah here. It would be great, as I understand it, the premise of that is to take entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs with a great idea and trying to see what can be achieved with their support in a 12-month period. And that's clearly a very tight time frame to achieve success for any business, let alone a social enterprise. So as I say, to set the context, it'd be great to understand how you measured that success in a 12-month period.
Yeah, great question. I think social enterprises, to start with, is still quite a misunderstood model. Actually, lots of people, when I left Accenture to go and run Year Here, lots of people thought I was going into the charity world. It's quite different. Social enterprises, most of them are businesses. They're limited companies typically, and so they need to demonstrate viable commercial sustainability, like many other businesses. So in the Venture Lab phase of the Year Here program, the final phase, we looked at business model, commercial sustainability. Financial rigor was as important there, if not more, than anywhere else, as well as some of the other things you'd expect to be looking for within early stage ventures. So commitment of the founding team, the extent to which they tested and prototyped with users, but most importantly was impact. So, and specifically for Year Here, that was the extent to which they really understood and had insight into the problem they were trying to solve.
Right.
And I'll give an example of why that's so critical. It was a story from, I can't remember who it was, but one of the Year Here health inequality panelists that comes to talk to the participants on the programme. And there's a hospital in East London, I think it was Homerton Hospital, that was experiencing really high levels of patients missing appointments.
Right.
And lots of interventions in that space or solutions often focus on sending reminders to patients, essentially a term in behavioural economics called nudge theory. But actually, a more thorough investigation of that problem found that it was actually poor transport infrastructure in the borough that was causing patients to miss appointments. Some of them were having to get 2 buses to travel just a couple of miles. So reminding patients with texts and letters wasn't going to solve that problem. So that sort of philosophy of insight is the cornerstone of Year Here's platform, and for launching social businesses, and is, I think, why it makes it such an enduring program and shaper in that sector.
Okay. There's a challenge, I think, for social enterprises around, perhaps in the heads of the entrepreneurs as well, but more generally around the profit versus purpose principle, if you like. And I wondered, Roshni, what do you feel about in terms of, can a social enterprise be too principled to the point where it compromises, its commercial viability? So perhaps putting purpose too far ahead of profit ultimately to the long-term detriment to the business. And can you offer any advice for social impact entrepreneurs in this regard? How do you balance those? First of all, are they conflicts, and how do you balance those two seemingly conflicting principles?
My viewpoint is, I don't think they can be too principled. I think it's the principle that defines the passion and the vision from the offset of what a social enterprise is trying to do. And one of the things I think Kelly and I both feel pretty strongly about is the setting out of the impact measurement as well as the commercial viability measurement of whatever a social enterprise is doing. If the right mindset and the right context is there to enable the entrepreneur to set both of those sides of the equation of their value case up, I think constant measurement of that through the journey and life cycle of the business should mean that this doesn't necessarily happen. But Kelly, I don't know what your viewpoint is.
Yeah, I think it's so important, and I guess I would say, because I'm biased, but I think it's quite easy to accept the archetype that putting purpose ahead of profit, the latter will suffer. And I guess because we've been kind of imbued with a set of business principles that are linear, short-termist, growth-oriented, and sort of this view that being purpose-oriented is sort of worthy and philanthropic, but it's not a nice to have. I think I'd say that if what we mean by purpose is sort of equitable access to products and services and environmental sustainability, then not putting those first will have a long-term detriment to business. And there's a really interesting movement that I don't know if some of your listeners might have heard of, but we've obviously all heard of unicorns in the startup world, the sort of nirvana that VCs are searching for, rapid disruption and scale, and then a founder exit. Facebook's often cited as the ultimate unicorn. But there's actually a kind of new movement that was started by 4 female founders countering that sort of traditional startup culture, called Zebras. Zebras, but you might have heard of it. So Zebras, because they've got sort of both stripes, they're profitable and can improve society. And interestingly, unlike unicorns, where maybe only 1 in 1,000 will ever succeed, Zebras actually exist. And they're a movement that has lots of support from funders. And it's really interesting and worth exploring that, because there's proof that this sort of other way does exist, and that you can be both for profit and for purpose.
Yeah, I've done a bit of research around the Zebra Manifesto. I'm very keen to have hopefully one of the founders on the podcast for that exact reason.
Yeah, they're amazing. I'd thoroughly advocate for that. Yeah.
Roshni, you touched on this in your introduction in terms of your experience, and there are an increasing number of voices that are talking about weaving some form or some level of social purpose into all or a number of innovation models. And I just wondered your views on, is this feasible, or does all technology development, for example, or innovation need to have an element of social purpose at its heart?
Paul, my viewpoint is it's not even a question around feasibility anymore. I think it has to happen. And the context that we're in right now is really driving why it's the time right now to make this the case. So innovation is paramount to survival, to success, to progress. And whether that's for large corporates or whether that's for governments and society, what we're seeing now with the pandemic, I think the far-reaching impacts calls for the use of innovation and everything that is being done to get us out of this and get us into a better space even more. So I think people, society more generally, they're fed up. They're frustrated with the self-interest of individuals, of corporations. We're seeing much more activism. I think the situation where the virus doesn't let anyone escape is brought a concept of we're all in this together. So people want to help. There's more of a community spirit and feeling of compassion. But at the same time, I think what we're seeing is a real highlight of how the system hasn't been working for a very long time, both from a socio but also from an economic perspective. And for sure, we're going to see an increase in gap. We're going a wealth gap, in education gap, in health gap, in the jobs gap, and this all needs to be addressed. Whether it's technology or not, innovation can really do that. I think if you then look at consumers from the perspective of their relationship with businesses, expectations are also really massively shifting. They no longer want to be sold stuff. We want to be buying things that help us in our life. We're doing much more online because we're forced to, but I think that will continue. When we're engaging in the physical space, we want to make sure organizations are thinking about our physical safety now, because we're going to have to live in a different world in how we interact. And we want more honesty and transparency about everything that we're communicated from corporate. So this means I think businesses are going to have to think about a different set of propositions and a different engagement model with their end users, and those are not just consumers anymore. And moving away from selling stuff to solving real life problems, and human-centered design, where you think about what the end user's actual needs and motivations are and why they need a particular service or product or proposition is, I guess, a key thing that businesses are going to have to focus on going forward, but not just from a consumer lens, from a broader ecosystem of end users, even governments actually. So there is, I think, a lot more need for technology-focused innovation in terms of their spend going forward. They're already starting with some initiatives like the contact tracing app, but I think there's so much more to do. Nesta brought out a report recently that said parts of the UK have missed out on almost 4 billion worth of R&D investment. And if you then extend that out to the private sector, that doubles to over 8 million. That's kind of nuts to think about. So innovation, I think, considering all of the things I've mentioned about not just big corporates, not just government, social enterprises, there's a big role to play now. And with the advancement of technology, it's just going to accelerate.
So I read an interesting article recently with one of the senior execs at Patagonia, the global outdoor surfing brand. And it was suggested in that article, they were very scathing about brands trying to retrofit purpose into their business model. I wondered what your view, given what you've just said, Roshni, and what you've said earlier, Kelly, about it being so central to any business and so important, but also even more critical given the environment we find ourselves in today. What are your views on retrofitting purpose? of any description into a business authentically?
Wow, gosh, I think it's so tough, because it comes back to this, ends justify the means conversation. I think if any business is truly authentically starting to think about its impact on people and planets, then that needs to be applauded, and that's a good thing. And I think the wider community needs to support with doing that. I think what's interesting is that it's not solely businesses that will lead the change for a more fair and equitable society and a planet that we can all, future generations can take care of as well as us. So I think businesses, and it's maybe quite a different mindset shift for business to imagine that actually perhaps the future of what they do is less about competitive advantage and suddenly purpose washing, if we want to call it that, but actually around authentically, for once, checking their ego a bit and maybe being allies in this movement for change. And it might be about partnering, and it might not be about the silver bullets and consumer advantage. It might actually be about collective action. And that's probably quite a different mindset shift for some large global corporates. There are many that are starting to do it well. Paul Polman's leadership of Unilever he stepped down now, but was fantastic. Championing that all businesses, regardless of size, would one day be social enterprises. So I think any movement where purpose is nearer the top of the agenda is important. But I also think before businesses start to sort of jump on the bandwagon, they need to address some of their more basic things. I mean, Salesforce is championed a lot as writing that manifesto last year, but Salesforce, didn't pay sufficient federal tax in the US in 2018. So, start paying the taxes first, and then maybe we can start to think about other impacts as well. So I think there needs to be a bit of real talk as well.
Yeah, the pain of tax is a whole other podcast, I think.
And I'll leave that to the experts.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about conscious capitalism, and compassionate capitalism seems to be the phrase at the moment. But in one guise or another, it's been discussed for many years. And I think of John Mackey's great book from Whole Foods, Conscious Capitalism, and you've just mentioned Salesforce, and they've called for more compassionate capitalism as well recently. But the reality is income and wealth disparity continues to grow. And I wonder why that is. Do you think it's a lack of will, a lack of a common inspirational thread that binds people together, or corporate speak but not corporate do, or just that maybe it's compassionate capitalism is an oxymoron? Maybe it's not achievable. What are your views on that enormous question in 3 minutes?
Roshni, do you want to start? Yeah,
I was on mute. I think, Paul, I think it is achievable, and I think there are a number of different factors of why we're not necessarily getting there right now. But I think we're starting to see the movement for sure, more than ever before. So if you think about all the different players involved in the context of a big business leadership, so be that the C-suite, be that the team leaders, be that employees themselves and the board, I think it's important to have the right personal values, which you then bring to the organization. If you care about this agenda, you will bring that to the organization rather than working alongside a set of principles that sometimes even conflicts with your own values. And I personally have experienced that, and it's not great. The point that you just made around brands, purpose washing, Kelly talked about, I think there's a lot of kind of lipstick use of the word purpose and the intent to attract more customers. So actually aligned to those personal values, how can you change the organization's focus to actually do good rather than doing what you think you need to do to attract customers to make more money? And this is where the personal self-interest measured on business and financial performance, as well as the societal measurement of what success and performance looks like, isn't quite right. I don't think there's enough diversity in businesses still. We're seeing more and more Gen Z as the new wealth holders in our society, openly talking about how they're so much more purpose and values led in everything that they do, not just in their work. And I really liked this Futura report that was out recently around consumer trends, and they talked about 70% of consumers wanting to know from organizations about sustainability. I mean, that's a seriously high number.
Yes, yeah.
Shareholders play another role. So to date, there's always been a focus on short-term value and financial value and growth. And then the system. So organizations are measured on, their success is measured on short-term shareholder value, things like EBITDA. And I guess the governments around the world uses GDP, which is somewhat an outdated form of measurement when we think about a broader scale of impact, particularly from a social and care perspective. So I think there's quite a lot of different things, and it is a mindset shift that's needed away from very long-standing traditional commercial practices, and it's hard.
Yeah. I mean, I have no doubt, regardless of sector or product or service, that the purpose-led business is the way forward for the future, but there are a lot of businesses out there, clearly, that are focused primarily commercially now. And it takes a great deal of courage and bravery in terms of the leadership team to accept what could be, in the short term, a drop in revenue or whatever it happens to be, or an increase in expense to get from where you are here to that purpose-led business. So you require board members, stakeholders, shareholders to have faith. And as I say, that requires a lot of courage. What other leadership characteristics do you feel these leaders are going to need to take their existing businesses and redevelop them into a more purposeful future business to mitigate that gap?
Yeah, I actually, when we welcomed new, we called them fellows on the Year Here program, to join the program and the movement, I guess we would call it, at their sort of welcome dinner. So any of them that end up listening to this will probably recognise some of these, but there are always a couple of characteristics that I would call out that I think are necessary for social leadership. But I'd actually argue these are things I would look for in any business leaders today. So the first, I think most important, is curiosity. I'm going to sound like a politician because I'm going to do three things. They all begin with C. Yep. The first is curiosity. I think listening, asking more questions all the time, and being open to having your mind changed, and then being kind of vulnerable when that happens, and being transparent about the fact that you have. Curiosity is necessary because you can't, without learning and without insights, you can't have action. And many businesses are on this learning journey, and that's okay. The second, you refer to it already, is courage. So it takes sort of a bold leader or leaders to not be kind of constrained by the orthodoxies or limitations of what exists today. So for social leaders, that's tricky because the path for social innovation and social entrepreneurship is pioneering. It's not well trodden yet. So they've taken a risk to even do that. And conversely, for commercial business leaders, that path has been trodden a lot of times before. But that doesn't mean that you can't seek opportunity to forge new ground. And I think the third is compassion. And again, you've talked about there's a lot of new language at the moment about compassionate capitalism and compassionate business. I think for me, what I've learned so much about with the different hats on I've had over my career so far is that what needs to change is systems. So for me, compassion is exactly that. It's seeking to change the systems, the structures, and the constraints that cause social and environmental injustice, and not the people who suffer its consequences.
I really like what's happening right now with the RBS group that's being rebranded to NatWest, and the new CEO, Alison Rose, has launched a new strategy to focus on being a purposeful business, which helps shareholders, colleagues, community, society. And the group has worked with an organisation which I think is brilliant, called the Blueprint for Better Business, who've created a framework to set out how they can build their commitment to all those different parts of society. And the RBS's journey has been a super interesting one. So I think there's an element of bringing in outside help with experts. Timing also plays into this. Context allows certain change to happen at certain points in time too. But it's going to be interesting to see their journey playing out.
Yes, it will be, absolutely. So One thing that fascinates me, I think, in terms of the mindset of an entrepreneur, social impact or otherwise, is, but in this context, you've got large societal problems, and they are exactly that. They're large. They're systemic, culturally, economically ingrained over many years. And you have a young entrepreneur, woman or man, who's got an idea for a social enterprise. However, their footprint, certainly in the short term and maybe over the medium term, may be very small. Their impact may be small and quite focused on a community or a particular problem. How do you work in a mentoring capacity with these young entrepreneurs to convince them that however limited their impact may be on the systemic challenges that society has, that they still need to go for it, that it's still important?
Gosh, yes. Well, one of the things is that I always say is that the path of being a social entrepreneur is tough, and it requires an inordinate amount of resilience. But what I'd also say is you're right, these issues are large and complex, and if they weren't, they probably wouldn't be worth solving. And it takes kind of boldness to even have a go. Even just in the past couple of weeks, as I'm starting to kind of test some of the ideas I have around, my hypothesis around the new economy, which by the way, many brilliant thinkers are thinking about, and I'm learning from them. Mm-hmm. If someone says, gosh, that's a really tough and tricky issue, that's great feedback, because why am I spending time on it if it's not? So, and in terms of the sort of systematic challenges and that sort of limitation of impact, I guess what I'd say is I'd encourage all would-be entrepreneurs, social or not, to consider the systems impact of their venture. Mm-hmm. The founder of Dark Matter Labs, a brilliant thinker, Indy Johar, gives a brilliant TED talk that you can go and find, yep, where he talks about the limitations of social innovation when it's not accompanied by the necessary systems thinking. So often founders focus on sort of single product and single service interventions. A sort of quite often cited but fairly illustrative example is Tom's Shoes, yes, which made the kind of buy one, give one Robin Hood model really famous. And although they have since adapted it, I think it was an Economist investigation in sort of 2016 or so, found the negative impact on local economies because it was actually putting local shoemaking businesses out of business. Right. So it's really thinking about the wider macro impact of an intervention you're making. And I guess the second thing I'd say is I'd encourage all budding entrepreneurs to think sort of beyond human-centered design and sort of constant consultation with users, which is of course valuable, to thinking about sort of alternative ownership models of businesses. So the next shift for an impact economy for me is going to be championing cooperative models, social enterprises, yes, community-owned businesses, stakeholder over shareholder decision making. There's a brilliant quarterly publication called Stir to Action, if anyone wants to sort of learn more about that, which I'd really recommend.
I think it also depends on your starting point, Paul. So yes, I'm working with this movement in South Africa right now, which is all around enabling young people in the townships to start up their own businesses, to create their own kind of steadier stream of income, but also enable those living in the townships and the communities to benefit from the services in an easier and safer way. And I was, through user research, interviewing one of the potential traders yesterday. They run an entrepreneurship program. And this guy sells his trade is going door to door to people in the township to offer any service. So if they need something picked up from across the township, he'll get a car, he'll get it, and he'll bring it to them. So we are proposing to build an app which will more easily connect traders and consumers. When we expressed that idea to him and to get his initial feedback, he was like, absolutely, that will make everyone's life so much easier. So I think it also depends on what the starting point is and what the problem is you're trying to solve. Yeah.
Kelly, I'm interested in the example you gave of Tom's and the unintended consequences that a social enterprise needs to consider. So the example you gave was putting local shoe manufacturers potentially out of business. I wonder where the balance is to be struck, because I guess as a social enterprise, you could spend a lot of time thinking about all those potential ramifications or unintended consequences, and would it actually start to stifle your innovation? At some point, do you have to accept that kind of utilitarian principle of the greatest good or the greater good when you start the social enterprise and delivering the most for the most people, if you like?
Gosh, yeah, good question. I think as a social entrepreneur, in fact, as any entrepreneur, if you're constantly founding something or starting something, doesn't just happen once, and that's why I think there's this myth of the startup, right? You start, you innovate, you scale, you exit, you're a hero. I think that's rapidly being deconstructed, and I think that's useful. And it's almost a shift away from the sort of purpose passion paradigm. I sort of sometimes question its value a little bit, because there was an article recently by Futura's co-founder Solitaire Townsend, and she talked about the end of the purpose brand and the rise of the servant brand. So this idea that effective social leaders will ideally be following a purpose that's practical, that's useful, that's addressing a need, as opposed to a passion project to do something that they love. And his founder Jack Graham talks about that as well. And I guess the commercial pressures are real, right? It's tough because at the moment social entrepreneurs are existing in a system that doesn't really measure or value purpose over profits, or really we don't know how to measure it very well. So, I lived that. Running a social enterprise is tough, and every day you're living those very real decisions and priority calls around, designing for impact, prioritizing revenue streams. Will this reach more people? But if I don't do this, will we exist in 3 years' time? It's very real. And I think there is a sort of a nascent and growing impact investment market, but I think today it's at sort of $500 billion globally. But at the moment, it's still quite restricted to verticals like clean tech, microfinance, or global health, which obviously are incredibly important. But it limits innovation in other sectors like journalism, education, which could desperately use it. So I think, again, I come back to my sort of hypothesis that systems change is necessary. Social innovation can't fulfill its promise without economic innovation, and it's not about sort of moving founders back in line with their purpose. It's about redesigning a system that accelerates and enables them to actually do that, and it's the system that needs to change, not founders.
Roshni, I spoke, as you may be aware, to a guy a few weeks back on the podcast, Mark Zawacki, who he's based in Silicon Valley. He works with big businesses, blue chip businesses all around the world, on their innovation models and how they can become more efficient and so on. His big frustration was that a lot of these businesses have innovation labs, and they very quickly become self-perpetuating, and they're actually just there to support the concept of an innovation lab rather than deliver anything substantial at the other end. And I'd welcome both your views on whether you think there's too much focus in business on thinking and not doing. So we always talk about radical thinking, but are we not radical doing? Is there not enough radical doing, just too much radical thinking, and those things don't get out the door, if you like?
He's right. So there are a number of different models that we're seeing in the industry in terms of how innovation is set up. So first model where there's a standalone innovation function or unit. Sometimes it's at the organization level, sometimes it's within the line of business. But the other model that we're starting to see more of is where the innovation culture, mindset, and processes are embedded in all functions of an organization. And so whenever any kind of change is being delivered, the way in which innovation is used in the innovation function is used to do that throughout. There are pros and cons for both models, I think, but what's important is once an idea is formulated enough, is incubated enough, there is the right business sponsorship from the right person in the organization to actually take that idea through to its delivery of impact in whatever sense that is. And the traditional normal governance mechanisms in an organization's change cycle need to be part of making that happen. Sometimes what happens when there's a standalone innovation unit is lots of great ideas, lots of new tech, let's incubate something, let's get an MVP up, and then you can't find a sponsor, or the appetite dies, or the new shiny toy comes along, and so there's no longevity. So yeah, I kind of see the shift needing to happen, and a big part of that is overall culture and mindset of an organization.
And I think the only thing I'd add, because Roshni has a lot of experience in this space in the corporate world, but the premise of your question, so you're right. I think thinking doesn't necessarily need to doing, but I'd also argue that, you know, doing without thinking is worse. And so, and so I think sometimes there's of course, you know, radical doing absolutely is necessary. And I think we're seeing at the moment a lot of doing, you know, as a response to the pandemic and to do quickly to save lives. But I think the next sort of the transition, the rebuild, the reset will need to be thoughtful. And actually one of the things I observed with, there's a sort of movement around sort of intrapreneurs. So sort of folks doing great things within organizations. And, you know, I think arguably Roshni and I could say we both had that hat a little bit at Accenture.
Yes.
But sometimes it's necessary, I think, for corporate leaders and any leaders of businesses to also look within the organization for great ideas. And sometimes those people leading change won't have innovation in their title. They'll be championing great things. They might even be doing it on the side, and they won't even, you know, innovation doesn't have to be big. It might be little micro improvements and interventions that are actually having huge change, but they don't go around with innovation titles on, and they might not even be talking about it. So it's up to business leaders to find, identify, champion, sponsor, help, support those people.
I'd like to, as we sort of get towards the end of the podcast, ask you a slightly broader question, but it does relate to a lot of what we've talked about in terms of the overall fabric of society. Many tech businesses are almost natural monopolies, and we can all think of a number that perhaps are. I'd love to get both of your views on what responsibilities you feel these entrepreneurs or leaders have to business and society and to government in return for that somewhat privileged position.
Yeah, let me start. So it's true, the tech companies are always getting in trouble these days, aren't they? And I think it's because their scope is increasing and comes with that level of responsibility in terms of their impact to consumers and society. A lot of negative things about the tech companies coming out. So elections interfering, social media impacting mental health. What can they do though? I think it starts with treating their customers fairly and with respect. And a big part of that, like we've talked about in a previous podcast, Paul, is around using their data in the right way. Yeah. I don't know how many of them are aligned with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm pretty sure not many. Salesforce, interestingly though, being one of the corporates that didn't pay its tax, has actually now publicly said it's going to align behind 6 of those, which is quite interesting. They should set the social impact agenda as part of their overall strategy, rather as well as fixing things that they've kind of identified mostly from the media. So, for example, Instagram looking at the removal of likes from people's posts to help prevent kind of further mental health challenges. Public-private sector, I think collaboration is important. So we're seeing Google and Apple work with governments during the pandemic to deliver this contact tracing app. We need to see more and more of that, particularly because of the large volumes of data that they hold. There's been talk of higher tax brackets needing to be paid by these tech giants. Again, Mark Banya from Salesforce was discussing this proposal for a high corporation tax, which would then be used to help the homeless in San Francisco, which is quite interesting. And then, of course, the ongoing agenda around diversity and inclusion. So I think steps have been taken to move forward, but I think these organizations have also moved backwards. Sexual harassment cases and so on are in the media still. And I saw an interesting study recently in terms of the diversity and inclusion measurements in Google. So in 2014, I think it's just over 60% of their employees were white and just under 70 were male. In 2020, so now it's 54% are white and still just under 70 are male. So it really hasn't moved, and I think that was a common trend across the big tech. So there's a lot of work to do in that space. And then I think there's a broader question around whether they should actually be monopolies and exist in the positions that they are, from potentially massive use of their position and coverage across large swaths of consumers, and whether actually they're driving anti-competitive behavior in terms of what they hold on those people. Much broader question.
Yeah, thank you, Roshni. It's a lot to think about. I think I'm not an expert in diversity and inclusion, but I think, especially given what's going on this week and the anti-racism movement, it feels impossible not to talk about it here. And I think one of the things, as much as before I was saying that, maybe the role of big business is to stand back and be allies in this movement and maybe not lead it. At the end of the day, I was reading a Forbes article yesterday, I think that 69 out of 100 of the wealthiest institutions globally are businesses. So they have power. And I think for me, as anyone that has a platform, I think it's no longer necessary now, whether you're leading a charity, a social business, a community organization, or a corporate. It's no longer sufficient to sort of just check your privilege, but actually sort of taking action about it and having responsibility to do that. And that can range from small micro actions to larger things. So asking yourself, who do I follow on social media? Who do I quote and reference when I'm given a platform on a panel, on a podcast? Who do I recommend for roles and opportunities? Who do we spend our corporate dollars with? What books am I reading? Whose opinion do I ask for? Who do I mentor? Who asks me to mentor them? Who decides about performance? Who's on our board? Who tests our products? All these questions, I think it's necessary, because ultimately inclusion is about power, right? And leaders, especially leaders of big tech companies, have the influence to redistribute that power, and they need to take that really seriously.
And I think as terrible as the pandemic has been and challenging, one positive thing to come out of it, I feel, is if you had said to anyone 6 months ago that a Conservative government would pay 25% of the UK's salaries, or there would be dolphins in the canals of Venice, or the whole, would have a 17% reduction in carbon, or the whole world's manufacturing, or most of the world's manufacturing would shut down, you'd be laughed at. But all these things have happened, which demonstrates that when there's a will and a need and an urgency and a purpose, actually anything is possible. And that's got to be, whether it's diversity and inclusion or social impact enterprise in any shape or form, anything is possible if there is a will, and it's all been proven now, hasn't it? And I think that excuse perhaps that business and governments and others make, that these things aren't achievable because ... Actually, this pandemic has proven that it is achievable. Anything's achievable. The unfathomable is achievable. People in India can now see the foothills of the Himalayas again. They haven't seen them for decades. And I think that is one positive thing to take out, that there can't be the excuses put in front of some of these initiatives anymore, because it is evidence that it is only the will that is in the way of achieving it, not anything else. Just before we go, we always sort of end this podcast with the new P&L to the point, which is guests giving one or two key takeaways that listeners can use in their business. So in terms of the social enterprise or social impact sector specifically, what are the one or two key takeaways or pieces of advice you'd like to give to those budding entrepreneurs who have a social impact idea right now in this environment and want to make something of it as we evolve ourselves out of the pandemic?
Kelly, do you want to go first?
Sure. Two takeaways. I think the big thing for me is it's the start, right? These things, so the movement for building a new economy, call it what you will, democratic economy, conscious capitalism. We could argue, you're right, the crisis has happened, but arguably capitalism wasn't working for lots of people way before that. So it's not about a moment in time. Things don't pivot on just a moment. It's about a movement. And there are brilliant thinkers, brilliant economists, many of them women, by the way, Mariana Mazzucato, Kate Raworth, who are leading the charge on thinking about designing this. And what's critical is that we know it's working. So there are organisations, and just go and find the case studies that are generative and not extractive. Olio, an app producing food waste through local redistribution. Better Group, that's democratising access to gyms by repurposing old leisure centres. John Lewis, one of the UK's most successful businesses, is an employee co-op. So we know it's working. We know it can work. So kind of, I would say to budding entrepreneurs, don't necessarily think about your scale, your innovation, your exits, and how rapidly you're going to grow. Challenge your funders and your investors about what and how they're measuring value. It's about deliberately kind of claiming a new language to prove that it works, and go and kind of join this movement about the new economy. And I guess I'd say to corporate business leaders, you can be an ally for new capitalism. And it's about kind of collective action. And I encourage them to go and read anything by Anna Wittenberg-Cox on Forbes, because she's writing a lot about this, and there's brilliant examples of people doing that.
Do you think, just before we move on to Roshni, do you think that there's perhaps some social enterprise entrepreneurs are almost the base level is, or the default point is apologetic? So we may not make a lot of money, but it's going to be a good enterprise. Whereas in fact, as you've just suggested, we should be going in and saying it's a great social enterprise, a great idea, and it will be successful, rather than the kind of the button between the two, if you like, when they speak to stakeholders and investors and so on.
Yes, I think there's a language shift. I mean, there's still very much some sort of solo founder hero worship, male entrepreneur hero worship in the social enterprise sector as much as the commercial sector. But yes, I think it's about not, one of the things when I left Accenture to go and run Year Here, occasionally people say, "Oh, that's very worthy." I don't think it's worthy. I wasn't doing it to feel good about myself. Yes. I did it because it was necessary, because I think it's the only way in which the economy and impact and innovation, it's the future of how business and how the world will work. And so I think entrepreneurs and social leaders in this space, yes, need to be bolder and unapologetic about what they're doing, and also being honest about the fact that it's hard and that it is a pioneering space and a pioneering way, and that there's many horizons of this change, and no, we don't have all the answers, and just kind of asking for that kind of term of like allies and support. This won't, it's different to previous movements. None of this will be we won't move to a new economy or new capitalism by the work of a few. It's yes. collective action that needs to include many voices that are not heard, and there's brilliant work and thinking going on, and hopefully lots of doing as well yes. as the thinking, but it is working, and the stats show. I mean, even yesterday I think the Dow Jones reported that as a result of the crisis of the pandemic, 51 out of their 57 sustainable indices outperformed the broad market competitors. So sustainable, social impact, purposeful businesses have been more resilient in this crisis than others. And if that doesn't sort of prove it to the people that care about those kinds of numbers, then what else does?
Yeah. And Roshni, your key takeaways from today.
We haven't talked about the B Corp movement, and this is something I really love, and it kind of links to what you've just said, Kelly. So B Corps are super interesting. There's 2,500 more growing globally. These are effectively corporations that have been verified from a social, environmental, performance perspective, and legal accountability for how they perform based on something they've signed up to is within the construct of the organization, and they deliver product services which help workers, communities, environment, other businesses, and they're all about long-term sustainable impact. And I would love to see the first corporate B Corp, because I don't think one exists at the moment in the traditional sense of defining a corporate, and I would love to see more and more of them. The second one for me is around culture and people and leadership. So we started talking about this quite early on, having the right personal values, bringing them to work, whether you're the entrepreneur, whether you're the board member, having the right level of diversity inclusion addressed in the organization, so that you bring different mindsets to people that care about the agenda. Setting out an environment where we as employees, as leaders, embody what we're trying to do in terms of achieving social impact. So principles around integrity, honesty, trust, care, looking after each other, having fun. The right culture for me, based on the right leadership and the right types of people, is what's also going to massively drive the agenda forward. Even more so in the corporate environment than in the social entrepreneurship environment.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for a fantastic discussion. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having two women on a panel about business. And it's not just about women in business, so thank you so much. That was great.
Pleasure.
Super interesting. Thank you, Paul.
No,
thank
pleasure.
you, Roshni, too.
To all of you who have downloaded and listened to this and the other episodes of the New P&L, I thank you once again for taking the time. And as I said at the beginning, If you like what you've heard, please take a moment to review us. It all helps with our ratings and our rankings. Finally, before we go, a quick word from our sponsor. This week, it's sponsored by UK multimedia design and animation studio Kamooka. You can check them out at kamooka.com, CAMOUKA.com. And if you'd like to consider a specific topic for the new P&L, or you'd like us to interview you, please drop us a line. Just go to principlesandleadership.com and send us an email through the service there. So I'm Paul from the new P&L, Principles in Leadership and Business. Thank you very much for taking the time.